My name's Rob. As you know, I'm a developer at Club Express. My boss just left.
So, now you're free.
Now. As you can tell by the title of my talk, I'm going to be looking at JavaScript functions. So if you have any questions or comments, please post them out. I'll try to answer them as best I can. And yeah. So I think what makes JavaScript such an interesting and a fun language, I guess, is that is the way that JavaScript handles functions. It's really unique as compared to other languages. So what is it exactly about functions in JavaScript that make them unique? If there's one thing you take away from my talk, I really just want to hammer this in. JavaScript functions are unique because they're really just objects, meaning that they can be copied, passed, returned as values. They can be passed as arguments to other functions. So it's kind of a unique approach to functions. So in order to really understand functions in JavaScript, then, it means we have to have a good fundamental understanding of objects. So I really wanted to get into understanding how functions work in JavaScript. And so in order to do that, we have to really get into objects and types within JavaScript. So you have two basic types in JavaScript. You have primitive types, which you can kind of think of as like the simpler data types, and then you have reference types, which are really just references to different locations in memory. I also want to point out that this is a common misconception before I actually get into more of the work between primitive types and reference types, is that JavaScript does not distinguish between primitive and reference types by storing primitive types on the stack and then reference types on the heap. JavaScript actually does away with that entirely. Instead, there's something called a variable object that lives within a scope. And if it's a primitive type, the literal value is stored in the variable object. And if it's a reference type, it's a pointer to the object in memory. So can we name all the primitive types in JavaScript? Does anyone know any of the primitive types in JavaScript?
String,
Boolean,
integer,
String, Boolean, number,
object,
int,
symbol.
A symbol, yeah, that's actually a new ES6 one. I actually don't have anything about that in here. And then there's also null. So those were the 5/6 types within JavaScript. And they're stored as little objects in that variable object I was talking about. So as the string, number, bool, null, undefined. If you don't give it a value, if you don't give a variable a value, it's just going to be marked as undefined there.
So is an object not a type?
Yeah.
It's a type, but it's a reference type.
Okay.
I'll get more into that in a little bit. So can anyone tell me what the output of this program would be? You have string hobby1 is bowling, hobby2 is equal to hobby1. We define hobby1 as be running, and then we output both of them.
Can you zoom that in a bit, Robert?
The
The DevTools? Yeah, you just Control plus in the DevTools.
Uh-huh. Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess I don't really need the entire example. But, what's happening in memory is that when we are assigning hobby2 to the value of hobby1, the value of hobby1 is copied into a new variable object called hobby2. So hobby2 is created and it's the literal value of hobby1 copied and assigned. And then once we change the value of hobby1, it doesn't change the value of hobby2 because it has its own variable object that stores its own variable in memory. And we can also find what the variable type is by using the typeof operator. So, type of hobby1, which I defined as bowling, was string. Type of 42 is a number, and type of Boolean is true. One minor note I wanted to make here is JavaScript doesn't make any differentiation between different types of integers. There's just number, and it's always a 64-bit floating point, no matter what. Other languages, of course, have like 32 and 16 bytes, but JavaScript doesn't have that. So typeof is great, but would it also work for null and undefined here? Anyone have any idea?
They're objects.
You're onto something, actually. It was kind of a trick question. Undefined is undefined, and null is an object. I actually forget the name of the committee. It's like the TC13 or something. But the JavaScript community. I'm sorry, what was that?
39.
39. Yeah. The JavaScript designers have actually recognized this as an error. That type of null is an object, and they have yet to fix it. One way you can kind of think about it, though, is that type of null is an object because it should be storing a pointer to a memory location, but it doesn't. And speaking of, there are reference types. So reference types just store the locations of objects in memory. And so to get a good idea of what an object is, it's a collection of name-value pairs that we call properties. The name of a property is always a string. And when the valuable property is a function, we can call it a method instead of a function. So if I were to do the same thing I did earlier with string, what would the output of this be? I have an object. I put the name on object to be Rob. I have another object that I point to object 1. Object 2.name is Ben, and I output both the names. Ben. Yep. So this is kind of a breakdown. When object 1 is created, it's a pointer to memory, and then we have the object, and the name is Rob. And then when we create object 2, it's a pointer to the same exact location in memory, and then we're changing it. And so then the name becomes Rob, the name becomes Ben. And so now both object 1 and object 2 are pointing to the same object in memory, and they are both manipulating the same thing. So one of the variables destroyed within a scope. Well, primitive types are destroyed when the variable object is out of scope. And when a reference type goes out of scope, the object still lives in memory, but the variable object that's pointing to it is then deleted. So a reference to that memory is gone. You can do a little bit of optimization where you can set the object to null, so it's a null pointer, and so that the garbage collector can be a little bit quicker on picking up on things. It's not necessary, though, because JavaScript is a garbage collector language. However, I have heard, though, that it's still good to do if you have a really large object to set it to null so that the garbage collector can kind of pick up on it quicker. I don't really know how true that is, though, honestly.
There's also a delete keyword.
Is there?
Yeah.
Is that a new ES6 one? Or?
No, it's been around for a long time.
But that's for deleting a key value, isn't it? Can you delete the entire object?
I haven't tried.
Oh, I know you can delete a key
Yeah.
and its value, but
Right.
I don't know if you can delete.
The entire object.
I don't know if delete object
I
is a
don't really
thing.
think you should use
I think you're making that up.
I'll stick to null. Okay, and so one of the objects we looked at was object, but there are a couple other ones too. There's date, the regex, and the array one. And then just like we can use the typeof operator, we can use the instance of to check to see if it's the instance of an object. Now I use this here for the instance of array, but you really don't want to do that because it doesn't really work with iframe. So if you have an array that's passed from an iframe into your current context, instance of will return false even if it is an array. So you want to use the array.isArray. I just shut off my computer. One of the poor designs of this is that the power button's right next to the F12 button. So I do that for the same one. It was a really bad idea. So if I have that, you can use array.isArray, and it'll return whether or not it's array. So that's what you want to use if you're going to be passing things from iframes to your current context or whatnot. So whenever you're checking for the instance of an array, make sure you're using array.isArray. This was mainly just an example, though, to show that you can use instance of operation to check objects. So that's all fun, but one thing that kind of I see is like, oh, but isn't really string an object? Because I can use dot notation on it and call it just like if it's an object. So primitive types could really be considered objects under the hood because they have properties and methods that we can access. And at first, this kind of looks plausible, but they're not. That first definition there of state is still a primitive type. What happens when you start using an object on it, like the state.character@, it creates something called a primitive wrapper type. So at runtime, the JavaScript engine will create a temporary object and immediately destroy it once the operation is complete.
Oh, cool.
And so there are 3 primitive types for JavaScript, which are string, number, and Boolean. So that first code I wrote is actually ran by the JavaScript engine like this. It creates a temporary object, gives me the character at it, destroys the object, and then returns from there.
That's cool.
Another point is what's to do with double equal and triple equal. When I first started, I was extremely confused by this. The basis of it, though, is that double equal will ignore types and try to coerce the values before comparing them, and the triple equal will check to see if both the types are the same and the value without trying to coerce the values. So what happens if we try to compare 2 objects here? Does anyone know what these last 2 expressions would return here in this case?
False. False.
Yes. It returns false because when it comes to an object, if you're using the double or triple equal, it's comparing to make sure that they're the same reference and not their values that are contained with them. So if you want to actually compare 2 objects, you have to write a function that will kind of do a deeper comparison between the 2. For primitive types, x triple equals y will return x and y if they have the same type and value. And for reference types, it's going to return true if they both reference the same object. So let's try something a little trickier. What if we have A be a new string, and we have B be the literal form of the string? Anyone know what the output of this one would be?
Why is it called trick question?
It's a trick question.
False.
Yes! Yeah, you got it right. Technically, the type of A is an object because we use the string constructor for it, and B is string. I was trying to give a little hint.
Well, I wouldn't have called it trick question, mate.
That tricked me. Okay. So now we kind of understand objects. We can start getting into functions because, like I said earlier, functions are really just objects, and that's kind of what's unique here. So if I use typeof on a function, it's going to give me a type function, and that's kind of cool. So functions also have a built-in reference type. Please never define your functions like this, though. For the 2 good reasons are, one, if you're using an IDE, good luck catching any mistakes or errors you made. And the second one is the JavaScript engine can't actually look ahead and perform any compiler optimizations. So it's just going to pass the string into the constructor, and it's not going to be able to tell how to optimize it pretty well. So that's a typo. I'm going to fix that. So how does it know? So how would the JavaScript engine know, though, that say hi in this case is a function, and why don't we have to use the instanceof operator like the other object we showed? JavaScript has a lot of internal properties that are defined that you can't actually access through code. So the one here in this case is call, which tells the JavaScript engine that this object has some executable code that goes along with it. Other internal properties, which are internal properties in JavaScript, are always notated by the double brackets. So the 2 here is, so call here, basically, if you use typeof, it's going to look, JavaScript will look to see, does this exist? And if it does, it's going to return true. That's why we can use typeof here and not instance of. And another thing, too, is that there's a bunch of other internal properties. There's like get, set, enumeratable, like enumeratable, configurable. And they're not actually accessible through code. So when you create a function, it's really an object, but it has this special call property that basically lets JavaScript know, like, oh yeah, this can be executed, and we can kind of look through it. So besides the terrible function, I'm going to fix that, function constructor. Functions can be defined through 2 different main ways, the declaration and the expression. So function declarations are what most people are kind of familiar with. You have the function keyword followed by the name of the function and the arguments that are passed to it. The other one is function expressions. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can use the lambda syntax, or you can just define an anonymous function straight onto a variable. And the difference between the two is that a function declaration is hoisted to the top of the current context. So if I'm writing a file and I have a bunch of different functions, and I'm kind of calling them in any order, no matter what order I'm calling them, and if I've made them through the function declaration, which was this one, it doesn't matter what order I call them. I don't have to have any forward declarations. They're just right there. And so I can just kind of calling them. If you have the function expressions, they have to be called in the order that they're created. So I can't reference a function that I've created further on down my file if it's called up here. So one way around that is you can just always put your function declaration, your function expressions at the top of the file, or you can just use function declarations. But those are the major differences between the two. And so since functions are really just objects, we can treat them like any other object pretty much. So just like in the other examples of objects, I was able to have one object and I created another object that points to the same object. Well, I can do the same thing with a function here. I can have a function, this function returns 5, and I have another variable that just points to the same function. So, and I'm able to call it in the exact same way. So we can kind of pass them around. And as what I hope to make clear here is that it's really the same syntax that I use in the object one, and I can just easily pass it around without having to worry about anything else. These functions also, since they're objects, they have other properties we can access, just like any other object. So if I wanted to find out what the amount of arguments that the function ID is expecting, I can do id.length, and it'll give me how many arguments the function is expecting. So if I call length on ID, it's going to tell me 1 because I've defined one parameter within the arguments of the can't think, parentheses. We can also access arguments passed to a function using the properties, the arguments property. So arguments is just an array of all the arguments that were passed to the function. As you can see here, I have function ID and not run, return. I have function ID, and I can just access the first argument. And so if I do ID 5, it'll know to return that. So you don't actually have to add in the function parameters to the parentheses. You can fully do everything through the arguments array. It's not really recommended. And at the end of the day, the arguments that you pass into the parentheses are really just pointers to the different objects on the array. So you can access them through either way. So something that's always fun is this. Every scope has a this object, which is defined and references the object that calls it. So we can manipulate this with some functions that are, or some methods that are on the function object. One of them is call. So if I have, so on the global scope, I'm going to define hobby. I'm going to have me be my hobby swimming and running. And then I have save favorite hobby. Now this isn't on an object right now, but I can still use this.hobby. Well, I can use the call function and pass it to my, so I use call on the function, and I can pass it what context it'll be. So if I pass it this, if I'm in the window object, it's going to go ahead and pass bowling, so it'll output bowling. If I pass it me, which is this object, this.hobby in this case is swimming, and the same thing with friend, so it'll output running. So we can actually change what the value of this context is within a function. Similar function would be apply, except just like I showed you how you have the arguments array that can be passed in, the second argument to apply is that arguments array. So this is basically the same exact example as last time, except I have arguments 0, which is the first index of arguments, and I'm saying, you know, this person's hobby is this. So I can pass in the context plus the person's name in an array of arguments that are then passed to the function.
Are there any practical uses of using .call?
No, but I think there's a better application.
Thank you for that.
Joe? How's that, Joe?
I think there's a lot of practical
Well,
applications
so
for using
what I actually think is
applying
more
call.
practical is bind, which was
Bind
this
is
is what I
totally,
wanted to get
but
into.
I guess the only thing I would point out that maybe you skipped over is on the difference between call and apply is simply that apply takes the array, whereas call takes the arguments just string separated.
That's
So they
a-
both do the same thing, more or less.
That's absolutely true, yeah.
Yeah.
If I define the parameters within my function of the arguments it would take, I can just start then and call after I pass the objects context, then I can kind of, or this context, I can just then pass the arguments afterwards, and you can have a long Yeah. So bind is the newest function for manipulating this. The first argument is in this context of the function. Every other argument is the name parameters that were defined for that function, and you can bind them then to the function. So in this example, I have add two values. So my function references this .num, and then I'm going to add whatever is passed into the function. So I have two very simple objects. One's 5, one's 10. And then what I'm able to do is I'm able to bind 5 to this, and now 5adder is a function that'll add 5 to whatever number I pass into it. So you can partially apply functions, and then you can partially apply functions, and then they can be kind of passed around. So if I always know I'm going to be passing around a 10, for example, then I can just go ahead and use my 10 adder, and then I can use whatever I want to throw into it. Yeah, I think that's a good one. I know you're talking about bind. You have anything to say on that?
Nope. I mean, I guess the other difference between bind and the other two is bind is not immediately executed, whereas call and apply are executed right there, right?
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Well, when you say add two values dot bind
Oh, I see what
5,
you're saying.
it is not executed at that moment. Whereas if you say call and give it a context, you're executing the function in a context. Here, your bind is probably the right word. You're binding it to a context so that you can execute it later.
Right. I see what you're saying now.
So the bind is actually executed right away, but it's
No.
not
Call and
used
apply.
right away.
Call and apply.
It's not used
Oh.
until you actually add it. So the bind is called right away.
Is that right?
Because
Oh,
it sets the value, but then it's not utilized until you
that
call
makes
5adder.
sense. I think that makes sense.
Awaiting arguments.
I think that makes sense. But I mean, if you execute it now and then you set up whatever variables you're going to pass into it. So if I say bind to 5 there, add two values, bind to 5, and then I figure out I figure out what my two values are going to be or whatever y is going to be, and then I execute it. Are you saying that the function is executed twice?
No, I'm saying it's so that's bind. It's executed once because the value is
Bind is
stored.
executed, but the function that we're binding is not executed.
Correct.
Okay.
And then when you hit 5adder 10 and 5adder
Now the
15,
function.
it's using that value which has already been set
Yes. But in
So
call and
bind was
apply,
then call.
the function is executed
at that time.
at that time.
Yes.
Whereas bind, it's not. The function isn't executed until you execute your thing.
Okay. Nice digression. Back to you.
No, that was very interesting. Okay, so there's a bunch of cool things, but I kind of wanted to look at some practicality or things you could actually use with these functions. So if we use the arguments, we can actually have a function where we pass any amount of parameters to the function. So I have like a function that just kind of gets the product of any numbers that are passed in, and I can just loop through the arguments array and get all the numbers and then return a product. You can do this with sum, you can do this with concatenation too, if you want to concatenate strings. And I'm sure people can think of a bunch of other examples. You can also overload functions then. If I can, there's another typo. If I have I can check for the length of the arguments, and if it's 0, I can have a default. So I can then assign the message argument be default and then log it. Or I can pass in a function, or I can pass in a argument, and it'll be logged then to the console. You can also overload a function by checking the types using typeof and instanceof. So if I call it contrive function, because I can really think of anything where you take in too drastically that are simple. So I can check if it's a string. If it's a string, I'm going to tack on the exclamation point at the end of it. Otherwise, if it's a number, I'm just going to double it. And then whatever else, I'm just going to return it. So this is a function that you could pass in any different types of arguments, and it can handle them. And so since functions are really just values, and they can be passed as arguments to other functions, JavaScript supports higher order functions. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most powerful features of the language and one of my favorite reasons for using it. So I have a function that's called lots of computations, runs a bunch of things. And then I have a function called run twice. And so I can pass it a function, and it'll run the function twice. And yeah, so if I don't want to write the function out twice, if I'm going to be writing, or if I'm going to be doing something twice a lot, I can just kind of pass this function. Even more useful, though, would be if we wanted to specify how many times we want to run a function. So I can do my lots of computations 5 times. So I can pass it the function I want to execute 5 times, and then the amount of times I want to do it. We can also kind of make some more expressive statements. One of them I like to use is unless. So you can pass in the condition, and if it's not true, then it'll run the function that's passed into it. So my example I kind of came up with was, unless I'm a math whiz, then I better study for the test. I'm not a math whiz, and I know how to study hard, so unless Rob is a math whiz, then he should study. So that's a way I can come up with a way to be more expressive with, it reads more like English. I guess that's one way of thinking about it. We can also return functions instead of just passing them. So this is a function that would take in a string, and it would also take in a name, and then I can make different greetings. So I have a Spanish greeting, and I have a German greeting, and I can pass in different people's names, and then I'll be able to get, I can kind of make some building blocks. If I see I'm going to be doing, you can abstract out basically, there's a common pattern in both greetings, and so if I know I'm going to be building it, I can have a function that kind of builds part of it, and then another one that takes another argument for it. There are also the built-in higher order functions on the array objects that I thought are always fun. You have map. It takes a function that transforms an element of an array and applies that function to each element in the array. So this is just adding 1 to each element in the array, and it's going to give me a new array with all the elements incremented by 1. Filter takes a function that returns a Boolean and returns a new array containing every element that returns true when it was passed to the initial function. So here's one where I'm checking to make sure things are even. And so if it's even, then it's added into this new array, and I get a new array out. So I have an array that has 6 elements. 3 of them are not even, so they're filtered out here in this case. Yeah.
Can you write that? How would that be generic? Because that's on my array. Can you have it that?
How would you write,
Can you write a
filter
function called filter that you can use on any array?
Sure. Afterwards, I'll try it.
Just to mention,
The filter inside could just be defined.
yeah, you could just, like, let's say, what's this doing? Returning evens?
Yeah. This is
So you could just have like a function called even numbers,
Yep.
and you just drop that right in there. So it would be myArray.filter, and then the argument would be even numbers, and your argument would expect to take in the array element as, and then the index of the element if you want, and then the array itself too now, right?
You just need to call it just needs to be-
Well, no, because you're calling it on the array.
No.
The
But don't
array
you get the? Isn't there a third argument,
But that's
and it's
what
the
I'm-
actual
Throw up
array?
3 arguments.
Yeah, the third argument is the
current
actual
element,
array.
the index, and the total was.
Yeah.
I feel like I lost that thread a little bit.
Your function of n return n mod 2, we're just saying that there could be a reference to that function, or I'm sorry, instead of the function written out there, you could have a reference to a function called even numbers. So it could just
yeah.
be myArray.filter even numbers.
Oh yeah, I was actually just doing this to save space so I could still put text explaining. But yeah, you could. You could write out is even that takes n and then returns this, and then you can reference it just like I was talking, because it's just an object, so we can reference it just like any other value and pass it to it.
Put it in the prototype and make somebody
No,
upset.
Final one I want to show here was reduce, which takes 2 arguments. The first argument is a function that takes 2 arguments. So this is a function embedded here that takes 2 arguments, and it returns in this case, the sum of them, and then an initial starting point of the array. You don't have to do, so this kind of mimics the product one I had earlier. If we wanted to make this times and then 1, it would do the same thing as my product function that I made earlier. And you could also do things like, if you want to get the greatest value, I can make one that basically takes 2 arguments and returns the greatest value, and then starting with an initial value, and then I could look through an array and get the maximum value or the minimum value. There's a bunch of different things you can do with them. And that's pretty much it. I wanted to thank the authors of Reveal.js because I thought this was a lot of fun to use. It's a pretty cool library for making slides. And all the slides are available on my GitHub.
Can we make sure that we get a link to your reveal, whatever it is, reveal? Can we get that on the meetup site so everyone can get to this?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you just
Because as soon as that goes away, no one's going to forget that unless they have a reference point to it.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
You can pause the
You just go to
screen
the,
when you're watching the video.
you
and
go to
it'll
the
be there.
comments of the meetup for this day, and you just add it in there. That's everyone will see that.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, cool. Any questions? Comments? You try to build that filter.
I got a comment.
Yeah.
One thing that was really like illuminating for me was when I was starting to read a lot of this, stuff about functional JavaScript and all this, I would see reduce, and I'm like, all these examples are always so contrived. Like, here's a list of numbers, and let's do something with it. But the initial value doesn't have to be a number; it can be an object, and
Could
you
be
can do
an
all kinds of
object.
stuff with it. And,
Yeah.
like that blew my mind when I first did that. So you have like an array of strings or an array of objects, and you reduce that, and then you can do all kinds of things, like create an object with certain values,
Yeah.
key, and put, So it's really handy for stuff like that too.
Yeah, exactly.
I usually call the arguments accumulated and current,
Yep.
right? And then you have, I don't know, did we get that from Redux or something?
Maybe.
I don't know where I got that from, but
One thing
yeah.
I find myself doing is if I have like a bunch of conditions and I want to see if they're true, I have like an array of Booleans, and then I'm going to loop through them and reduce. And if any one of them is false, I return the false, and then I know the whole thing is false if I need all the conditions met.
Well, now they have, what is it?
Sum and every.
And sum, yeah.
Yeah.
So
What is it?
they have shortcuts.
Sum and every. So array.sum would return if overall, so var.
How dare you?
So whatever your variable is, x equals array.sum, and then you, just like you were doing, what'd you have there, filter? Just like you were doing filter, so dot sum, and you have a function that's going to return true or false, and on sum, if one of them is true, it evaluates to true. On every, if one of them is false, then it evaluates to false.
Oh.
So you
I'm
can
writing it out like a sucker.
no, you're fine. But you could technically,
It was mainly a joke.
yeah. Filter is super valuable too.
No, I
Without
use
a
it a
doubt.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing about function declaration versus function expression, I'm glad you used the correct function declaration because of quote-unquote wasting. But one thing, and I say that just to Joe, because Joe hates the function keyword. But one thing, and I much prefer function declarations for quote-unquote hoisting and code readability, but one thing to note as a gotcha is that you can overwrite a function declaration. I mean, I've never done it in like 10 years of writing JavaScript, but you can. And so also one of the best practices is if you're not going to do that, to use a const and then assign an anonymous function to it, and then you can't overwrite it.
I actually have a note about that. Yeah, when you have function declarations like that, the one that is last defined in the file is the one that wins out. So he's absolutely right. You can overwrite a function doing that, and if you use the anonymous function and use the const keyword, you can kind of avoid that, or at least you'll get errors when you know that there's a problem.
Or it doesn't have to be anonymous, it could be named too.
Very
so
true.
You could const whatever and then the same name. And that used to be helpful for like the stack trace, for finding errors on the stack, but they changed that in the S6.
I think it's still a problem if you do a default export and you just return a default fat arrow function. It still has a problem there.
Yeah,
So I think people will do that, and then your
about
stack
that,
traces
so-
are off.
But I thought that they bound the name of the function to the anonymous. That changed in the S6. That's still an issue.
I don't know. I thought for modules it was an issue.
It might
to
be.
do that.
Might be
I don't know.
modules, yeah.
But I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's bad.
Now, practical question. Some of those basically there are different ways of accomplishing the same task at hand, like accessing the parameters using the array. But the question is, why the heck would you want to even do it? I mean, pretty much it destroys this solid mentality.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't use that unless I'm doing something where I want to accept any amount of parameters. That's the only way I ever use it. It's much cleaner if you see what functions you're accepting within like the parentheses and then you're accessing them. My kind of the focus of my talk though was emphasizing that functions are really just objects, and so that's why I was trying to really just bring out the fact that you can use the objects array. But I do think that's a good point. You really shouldn't be using it.
Unless it's something like sum these values.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying.
You can't
Yeah.
have n arguments, so you just don't specify them and you loop through your arguments.
Yeah, if I'm gonna if I don't know how many values are gonna come in, then I'm gonna use arguments, which is
Well, so React is kind of, well, JSX is kind of built on that. Like, they call it variable arity.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
arity, so arity is the
that
amount
it?
of arguments you're expressing.
So, like, you when you're using the function React.createElement, you know what's going to happen with everything after the first two arguments, but you can have as many of them as you want. And then there's REST, which I think Steve is going to talk about, which is I really care about these, and the rest of these I need to like shove them off into something else. So like that's where you're saying like I do need the first two arguments maybe, and then the rest of it just call it REST. I don't care how many there are or what's in them. I'm really just usually forwarding that on to some other function.
That's a good example. Yeah.
And plus, like libraries, a lot of times you'll see if you look at library code, there's a lot of call and apply because they know what you're going to give them. They just know that they're going to have to execute something on. They're going to have to execute their function against whatever context you give it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a question, it's more of a general comment for those of us that are more stupid in this room, that kind of understand it but don't understand it. This is very fundamental, this is what you can.
Yeah.
It's not why you would, right? So this is not a criticism, this talk or anything.
He
It's
gives
more
this
of-
to me every
Yeah,
time.
he just does this. Don't even listen to him.
What would be really useful would be to see something of, here's 15 lines of code like we would all think, right? This is what it is, right? There's 15 lines of code, it's 15 lines that you have to maintain, right? This is why you can write that as one line of code, right? This, to me, is the real power of what you described today, is code maintainability and simplifying what it's doing, right? So rather than looking for it, hey, look how cool and complicated this could be, why would you do it like that? So this is fine, it's very fundamental, this is what you can. What I would like to see is, why would you? Because for those of us that are slightly more stupid than the rest of you, I need to understand how I can go from my very procedural JavaScript of everything that I'm doing, why is this better?
This is
Right.
why Mark lets us use this office.
So he gives his
He's trying to get more out of this. Like, here's what I need from you people.
But in all reality, looking at the gamut of people that are in here, if they're here to actually learn why I should do better in JavaScript, something like this tells you what you can, but it doesn't help me get better. Right? So this is cool, and it's great theory, but I would love to see someone talk about why this is better. Because you can take this and you can do this with it, and this is more maintainable, it's easier to do, it's easier to change, it's more powerful, blah, 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 blah. Whatever it may be. Right? Because
I think you
love
need a whole
this
talk
is
just on
brilliant,
array
but
methods
I
and
don't
when to use
know
a for
how
loop.
I can make my code better by doing this.
But you're assuming that your code will work. And the point of this.
You don't know me!
No, that wasn't meant to be passive aggressive.
But it might.
It wasn't meant to be. But the point at which your code doesn't work, and then you need to know why it's not working, is where the fundamentals come into play, right? Like cars, if I didn't know how an engine worked, or how like various parts work, like I can hack away on the car, but I'm never really going to understand
Yeah,
what
but
I'm doing.
I'm never going to write code like that.
You're never going to write a filter?
No.
So he's not referring to the
Man,
filter.
we need
He's
to do
talking
an intervention on Mark's code.
So wait a second, I have to stand up to.
Well, you don't write code.
Wait,
You don't write code.
Yes, you basically go into those. You go into libraries, okay, the JavaScript libraries, and I'm not a pro. I pretty much I'm coming from C# and using TypeScript for the very explicit reason that I don't want to go into these nitty-gritty details. When I'm trying to use a library, I want it to work. I want to be able to access it and understand the library. Okay.
You want jQuery.
Documentations, which actually doesn't explain everything. Okay. So when I have a function that has a hidden argument,
Okay, to me, it's of no help. So when he talks about how my code's gonna be better, well, to me, it's like this. This is a roadblock. I have to stop, and then I have to understand what the heck the other guy is trying to accomplish by
so
looking at the source.
the whole arguments thing, you're pretty much right. You really only ever see that use some polyfills use it. You really only see that more in like library code, and when you do get to library code, that's where you start seeing a ton of call and apply. Bind, I think you see in kind of everyday work. You start, we talked about generators, and generators is where you see in libraries, and polyfills is where you start to see that stuff. But it's to your advantage to understand those things, so that when you do get in a situation where you've just written out a really complicated piece of shit, like, oh, I could have just filtered the fucking array.
Okay, but I'm going to walk away from this and I'm not going to remember how filter works.
You need to do. We need to talk on array methods. Like, I can't believe we do, but we do.
This code can be achieved by filter. I will remember that filter is better.
You chose the wrong argument here, okay? Because filter, unfortunately,
super
is so
useful
powerful and so functional that your beginning of the argument, okay, when it used that your code is functional, well, this is what you would use. But he basically brought up some other functionality that does not refer to the filter, which you guys of course picked on.
The whole
which is basically so annoying sometimes.
The whole arguments thing that he showed, you almost never use that, and especially now, if there was extra shit, you just use a REST operator.
You guys are coming from the perspective of you are JavaScript developers.
That's
right?
this whole room is
No,
JavaScript. Everyone here except for you.
No, it's not. It's not. There are
It's a JavaScript group, I
There are a ton of people that create web pages that are .NET developers or Java developers.
I mean everyone in this room.
No,
I'm .NET, okay?
No, I just.
No, you're TypeScript now.
Jonah,
You're almost JavaScript.
Almost
.NET developers. Jonah and we're .NET.
Yeah, I was a .NET developer, and Classic ASP before that.
I'm
We
just
didn't call it
saying,
Classic
If
ASP.
everybody in this
was
room
modern.
understands that, then why are we having a talk like that? All right? If everybody doesn't understand a talk like that,
Well, this
then we
talk
have
wasn't
to-
about array
Okay,
methods.
This is entirely. This is a lover's tiff over here. I would like to see something that comes from why this is better than the procedural code that we all learn to start with.
Hey, Robert. You should just
Yes,
open
we
up a
should
text
do it.
editor and write out
Yeah.
a filter
Right.
without
Yes,
that filter.
Right, exactly.
Without that filter?
No,
You don't have to.
I think it's a good idea, though. From the
But without using array
Yes,
method,
you're
so it's got to be an
back.
actual for loop, and then you just check the value and you add it to a new array. So like you would do a for loop over this array of numbers, right?
Yes,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
exactly.
6. You do a for loop, and then you would check, is it even? Then add it to this new array, which I'm keeping
Right.
track of and building up, and then at the end of it, return the new array.
Right,
But this does that for you.
right.
So it's
But by
one
showing
line
the example
versus
side by
at least
side,
6 lines.
by side actually shows you this is what it does, as opposed to
See,
just
but
saying,
you're talking
"Wait,
about
that's
most people new to JavaScript don't even know about for loops. They know about this. This is the beginner's step. Filter,
No,
reduce,
no.
map,
Someone
for
called this
each.
presentation.
I don't
Sounds
think
like
that
a
you're
fine
right about
presentation.
this document.
It does.
Someone just needs to step on.
It's like,
Yeah.
Mark, it's like you went to a restaurant, like an Italian restaurant.
I don't know how to
Why-
edit
why
this.
didn't you bring me It's like Rob gave you all this stuff about functions. You're like, well, why didn't you give me more about this thing? It's like, well, that wasn't
No,
really
no.
what he talked about.
No, wait a second. There was actually a
Poor
library.
Steve is like ready to give his presentation.
This is true.
Yeah.
All right.
How do I stop the recording?
You turned off your laptop, it stopped.
Mark,
Oh,
what about
finish
this
recording.
recording of that?
Yeah, you're awesome. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.